everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Get Brant's Rants. So, this is a second or third try on on this because I tried to do a video earlier and it ended up being way too long. So, I'm going to try to keep myself brief. I'm going to use a little bit of notes here, so I apologize if I'm going up and down. Because I'm just going to try to keep myself on track. So basically, I wanted to talk this week about harm reduction in general. So I sometimes say or joke that I have a harm reduction philosophy to life. And part of that is, so there's actually a little bit of an irony there because, again, one of the biggest things that I think we get accused of on the left is that we're too purist and everything else, and I don't think that could be, well, so there is something to that sometimes whenever certain people, and even myself, like whenever I'm like the only way to do this the right way is blah blah blah, but in general, it's an attack that's a bad faith attack to try to kind of keep us loyal. I apologize, my hair is a mess today. But it's basically, with regard to politics especially, it's all about moving in a certain direction. And are you moving in the right direction or the wrong direction? And that's where it's a thing of, whenever we're campaigning and things like that, we want to talk about goals. And, if your end goals are going to be something that doesn't end up actually helping people, well, that's not a problem of purity. That's a problem of you have bad policy positions. And, you can't just be like, oh, but it's better than the other one. It's like, when you're talking about people who are actively seeking to ruin other people's lives, then, yes, of course you're going to be better than them, but come on. But anyway, so with regard to harm reduction, part of it is kind of coming off of, to some degree, there's, I wanted to give credit. I've recently been watching a lot of the Hills Rising program. I think they're actually excellent reporters. I really do. There's, and it's not just, yes, I agree with most of Crystal Ball's analysis on it. I really appreciate Sagar's analysis on a lot of things because of the fact that, first of all, there's a little bit, where I'm like, how are you a Republican whenever you can actually have this analysis? But it's helpful for me because of the fact that it does, in fact, get around that whole thing of either you're on the right or the left, you're a Republican or a Democrat, and that's all there is. Those are your options, and as long as you're better than a Republican, then you're okay. Anyway, so there's basically four things that I wanted to talk about harm reduction in the context of, and just kind of getting a little bit into what is harm reduction, like what does it mean, and so the first thing is I do want to talk about it with regard to specifically COVID-19 and the pandemic and the fact that we've been relying on public policy in the lockdowns as our means of responding to the pandemic, and the reality is that we really need to take a harm reduction approach to this pandemic because of the fact that people are going to have to take risks, and frontline workers have been taking risks this whole time, but it's the majority of Americans, I think, have been shielded from it because of the lockdowns, and the reality is we need to start thinking about things less in a black and white and more in a gray scale, which is the harm reduction approach. And, so COVID-19 is the one. Sexuality in general, especially, a lot of us talk about the similarities that we see and feel with regard to COVID-19 as compared to HIV/AIDS. And so for the LGBT community, as we are, HIV/AIDS has been around for a really long time now. And so our experiences with it are very informative of how we're going into this. And so I want to talk about that with regard to sexuality in general. And then I have another anecdote that I actually wanted to share with everybody that I think is important and helpful with regard to this. I'm only briefly going to touch on with regard to drug abuse or substance abuse. Not that I don't think it's relevant, but because I think if you don't get how harm reduction impacts upon substance abuse issues, then you just don't understand harm reduction. That's one of the biggest things. And then just with regard to public policy in general, and, how can we try to do better than we have? Trying to talk about, because we have, yes, there is a lot of infighting with regard to politics, and unfortunately, I'm one of those people who frequently argues that, we should have more infighting and more arguments, and we shouldn't all be jumping on any bandwagons at all. I think arguing and infighting is actually healthy, and we'll get into that. So, one of the things, and why I brought up the Rising program, is that they actually had run a story this week that I thought was particularly insightful. And they were, talking about the fact that, while most of us are looking at these kind of anti-lockdown protests, some of them are legitimate protests, and then some of them are clearly astroturfed white supremacist terrorists. Hey, if you're armed marching at a state capitol who has to shut down their legislative session because you're armed in the Capitol building, you are no longer a protester, you are a terrorist. There, I said it. I mean, come on. COVID-19. So one of the things with this article is just saying, we could demonize people as much as we want to, but at the end of the day, here they are. And, that we still have to deal with them both electorally and legislatively. We still have to deal with the fact that they are a part of our society in general, and we have to respond to them in some way. And, demonizing them is one thing, but, the reality is, and this story had actually, whenever I post to the site, I will make sure that I include a link to that story, because I think that'll be helpful for people to understand the context. But, the reality is that economically, a lot of people are suffering because of these lockdowns. And even though there is whenever we talk about the astroturfing, there's a lot of bad faith actors who are taking people's economic insecurities and diverting them towards taking action in ways that are not in the interests of the people who are taking part in these protests, and instead the people who are funding them. And, I mean, it's easy to happen. We all get diverted in specific ways and everything else. So, trying to, again, take as nuanced as a take as you can with regard to these protests, because of the fact that there's a lot of shittiness to them, but learn the lessons that you can from it, and so that's where we're going to go with this, and on the sense of harm reduction. So whenever people are going through and being like, oh, it's tyranny that I have to wear a mask, that's a freaking problem, because in a harm reduction approach, it's like, what does it hurt you to wear a mask? It's kind of like in the heyday of HIV/AIDS, whenever it was at its worst, it's like, what was the resistance of so many people to wearing a condom? It's the same function. It's the same sociological function with regard to people don't want to listen to it, and people might resist it, but at the end of the day, it's just good preventative measures. And so, using the analogy, and I'm going to get into the sexuality on it sometime a little bit here, is that it was unhelpful for those of us during the times that we did say you should only have sex with a condom every time, and never, ever, ever don't use a condom, and I'm going to publicly shame you and treat you like you're an awful human being if and when you ever have unprotected sex. That is an example of not harm reduction. That's all or nothing, and if you're not absolutely perfect in your prevention measures, then you're an awful human being. And the reality is, we all mess up, we all make mistakes, and what really helped was for people to try to use a condom whenever you can, for when you have a situation where it's like, oh no, I engaged in unsafe sexual practices, then refraining from having sex as much as you would normally, and getting tested and going through the period and knowing the particulars of HIV and HIV testing. Now there are tests that you can test a lot sooner, and tests that test for the virus rather than the antibodies and everything else. But there was a time when it was just dealing with the antibodies. So if you were exposed to HIV, you would have to wait 6 months before you could actually get tested reliably and know whether or not you actually had contracted HIV. And during that 6 months, you're kind of in limbo, where it's like, you're Schrodinger's HIV patient. You may or may not have HIV yourself, and so you don't know. And so you have to act as if you are HIV positive, and therefore engage in sexual practices in a way that is protecting your sexual partners, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what real harm reduction is, yeah, you're not necessarily perfect, but at any given moment, you try to do what is in the best interest of not only your own health, but the public health as well. And this is how we need to structure our discussions and our arguments with regard to COVID-19 right now. If you can help going out into public, and if you can help interacting with people in ways where there's a potential transmission one way or the other with regard to COVID-19, try not to have those interactions. Try to stay home more if you can. If you can't, or if it's just like you are going absolutely stir crazy and you need to get out and everything else. It's find ways where you're limiting the amount of contact that you have, where you're understanding the mechanisms of action of how COVID-19 specifically does end up promulgating, and replicating, and do the things, just because a cloth mask isn't perfect, it's still better than nothing. An N95 mask is even better. But just because you can't be perfect doesn't mean that you shouldn't take any precautions at all. And that's the heart of what harm reduction is just do what you can and try to be better today than you were yesterday. With regard to sexuality, here's my little anecdote that I think is funny that I would like to share, and I apologize to my kids if they're a little embarrassed by this, but so in my elder kids' health class, where they were dealing with sexuality and everything, but of course, schools especially tend to be very much more black and white and like don't talk about anything specific, and the focus is always on abstinence. And so here's the thing: is abstinence actually the best method for preventing pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases? Yes. Is abstinence the only thing that anybody should ever talk about in dealing with sexual education? No. And so here's the thing, and so one of my favorite kind of statistics to quote is the fact that abstinence-only education programs are 7% less effective than no education at all. So people who don't even have a sexuality program, pregnancy, STDs, and everything else system actually are more effective than programs that say the only safe way to prevent pregnancy and STDs is abstinence. Abstinence only is less effective than nothing at all, which means that it is literally counterproductive to its stated intended efforts. We'll get into, the reality is that the people who tend to bankroll all of the ideas behind abstinence-only programs are bad faith actors who actually are really trying to restrict people's options and make people dependent by feeling like they're imperfect, and so therefore they deserve the horrible things that happen to them and their families and their children, rather than trying to actually reduce unwanted or unplanned pregnancies and STD transmission. But so my kid was doing a thing, and so like one of their essay questions, and because they came to me and they were like so proud of their answer, and I ended up, because they thought I was going to be so proud of them for calling out abstinence only stuff for being so negative, and yet my response wasn't what they were hoping for. So they had this thing, and it was, this essay question that was like, you have a friend who's, considering, how would you structure an argument where you're trying to convince them to be abstinent? And so, of course, my kid was like, like they did the whole teenager rebellion answer, what I consider, which is like abstinence doesn't work and everything else, and people are gonna do what they're gonna do anyway, and you should just stop. And is this whole like the angry rebellion answer, which I mean, legitimate. It's a legitimate argument. But of course, my response was like, well, because you have to understand that as a method, abstinence actually is the most effective method of preventing pregnancy and STD transmission. But abstinence-only education being less effective than no education at all, the reality is, and what I ended up having to explain, is that comprehensive sexuality education actually makes people more likely to engage in abstinence than abstinence-only education does. And that fact in and of itself should be the answer, to all of these, people and politicians and program analysts and everything else, to say we need more comprehensive sexuality education. That's not how politics works, because politicians who don't know any of this information, don't have that, just want to kind of pander to a base that says, no, people shouldn't be having sex, you should be telling my children not to have sex. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that. But it's part of the ongoing frustration of experts aren't the ones who are making our public policy. We only have people who want to virtue signal as public policy, and virtue signaling is awful. So the reality is, when you use a comprehensive education platform, and this is regarding sexuality, not only are people more likely to be abstinent, but people are then more likely to utilize things like birth control, condoms, PrEP, now that PrEP exists, things like that, in order to reduce their risk and maintain a sense of personal responsibility. Because again, it's that thing of like, when people are in a conversation and they can have that discussion of, hey, I'm on PrEP, but I don't have any condoms, and you can decide whether or not you're going to actually have sex with that person or not. And, you or they may feel some kind of way about whatever decision that happens and everything else, and you might come into conflict with each other, but that's okay. Because at the end of the day, as long as you're making informed decisions and doing things, through those informed discussions, you're always going to end up making better decisions than you would have otherwise. So that's the same thing with regard to drug abuse. Whenever we talk about needle exchange programs, I don't think needle exchange programs should even be controversial anymore, but a lot of the times they are. They universally work with regard to helping make the situation better. And whenever we talk about, I had started taking some classes with regard to substance abuse counseling, and universally, it is better to, in dealing with people who are recognizing that they have a substance abuse problem and that they want to improve in some way. A lot of the time we end up kind of discrediting or discounting programs where the end result isn't that the person quits whatever drug it is and never uses it again. That we use that as like, this is the perfect, and if that doesn't happen, then we failed. And, part of the more recent movements in terms of both policy and understanding of substance abuse counseling is that if you can help your client to just do better, maybe they're using in an unhealthy way, try to make it so that they're limiting their use. And, sometimes that doesn't work because people will always make excuses and things like that. But, it's having systems of accountability. It's having people take ownership over their own use and abuse, and trying to make better decisions or healthier decisions. And if they're at least doing better than they were, that's still progress. It doesn't have to be the ultimate, now they're never using any drugs ever again and they're going off into the sunset. It's great if you can have that happen and have that be the outcome, but it's not always going to be the outcome. And sometimes, when I'll say, while I was at taking mental health counseling through the inpatient program, I had one of our, I remember an interaction where, somebody was being very down on themselves for only being clean for 3 months. And they were saying, oh, what if I'm always just going to be this addict and everything? And one of the things that I remember saying is, hold on. You were clean for 3 months. You were clean every single day, every day of that 3 month period. You made those healthy choices. You relapsed once. That sucks because that kind of resets you back to day one. And yes, that's extremely demoralizing. But don't take that as I give up and I'm never going to give effort again because I'm destined to relapse again. Because even if you do, if you're only relapsing once every 3 months rather than continually using every day of those 3 months, that's a victory. That is absolutely a victory. And maybe, all right, so maybe you didn't do you only did 3 months this time. Maybe next time you can make it to 6. Maybe next time you can make it to a year, whatever. But that's where harm reduction as a philosophy, harm reduction as a general policy interest always works better, because you're just trying to be better than yesterday. And dealing with substance abuse, there's a lot of philosophy both in AA and a lot of things of just take it one day at a time. Because if you try to think about it as, I can never take this drug again, or I can never have sex again, or I can never have sex without a condom again, or whatever it is, you are destined to fail. Whereas when you take it as just one day at a time, I just have to make the right decision today. I just have to make sure that I'm, abstinent today. Or whatever. Because again, whenever we deal with sexuality and abstinence, especially with the concept of abstinence with younger people, teenagers and such, it's like, maybe just try to be abstinent up until a certain, whatever. Like, hey, let's wait until this time or this time or whatever. There's a value in waiting until you're old enough to be able to handle all of the complexities that come with having sexual relationships. And there's nothing wrong with having those concepts of waiting and building towards something. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean like, this whole idea with being like, with a lot of Christians, which is like, wait until you're married. Well, marriage has its own set of stuff. And also, sociologically, when marriage was a different institution than it is today, um, and people were getting married as teenagers, maybe it was probably a lot easier to wait until marriage when people were still getting married as teenagers, and things like that. Now, whenever, a lot of people aren't getting married until their, 30s and 40s, waiting to have sex until you're married, it's a lot harder to do. And so it's just having realistic expectations for people and with people about, what are the things that you're really trying to promote or protect against or whatever. So that's my thing, and I don't want to go into a 55-minute video again, so I'm going to leave off with those kind of, main points. But, politically especially, because help is not coming public policy-wise. And this is not just a Republican thing, that Republicans are in charge. Democrats, we have a ton of really bad faith actors on both sides of the aisle. They're good faith actors too. I would like to think that Mitt Romney is starting to see the light and can continue to be pushed in the right direction as we move forward. Maybe he's being a bad faith actor and he is just being completely cynically pandering for approval on the left for whatever reason. Maybe. But at the same time, I do want to give credit to a lot of these Republican lawmakers who are coming to see the light with regard to things like, just with regard to making sure that poor and working class Americans are taken care of during a health and financial crisis. Because at the end of the day, we're all still human. And again, I hate this, what I call the bad side of identity politics, which is my identity is a Democrat or my identity is a Republican. That's a problem, and it only leads to problems because it does lead to this us and them, our side and their side, and we're just trying to win. It doesn't matter what we do with the power that we have when we get it, because it does matter. And that, from a progressive standpoint, policy is the only thing that matters. So who cares if it's a Republican who signs on to it or a Democrat who signs on to it or whatever? Policy is what matters. And you support the policy no matter who or where it's coming from. And that's hard to do, because it is a matter of trust. And, so for me, myself, I'm much less likely to trust anything coming from a Republican, but it's kind of getting out of that comfort zone and saying, hey, there are these few Republicans who are coming forward with these policy proposals that are a bit better. Let's, maybe we're going to grit our teeth a little bit and really get into it and wonder what's behind this, but at the same time, you still have to get into it. And you still have to give credit there, because we need to do better. We need to do better in general. And if we don't give credit to those Republicans who are doing it, then we're stuck with that dynamic of these bad faith actors who are on the Democrats' side who are saying, hey, you're never going to get better than me, so I'm not going to give you anything, and I'm not going to do anything for you public policy wise, and you're stuck with me because what are you going to do? Go to the Republicans? That has been a Democratic tactic since the Clinton era. I would even say before that. I wasn't paying attention before Clinton because I was too young. I'll just say that. So I will only go back as far as Bill Clinton. But and I use James Carville as the ultimate example of that. That idea of who cares what we do, just get power. Because that is his political philosophy, and I think that's the kind of representation of all that is wrong with the establishment Democrats, is the idea of get into power, who cares how you get there, and who cares what you do with the power, just get power. It leads ultimately to an authoritarian state, which is why a lot of those Democrats went right ahead and renewed the Patriot Act and gave the government even more power and oversight, and why Obama was utilizing and strengthening those Patriot Act things on spying on Americans, and those drone strikes and all the things that Obama did that were actually horrible, that many of us, and I will say, I remember conversations where I said, where people were pointing these things out, and I was like, oh, but why are we only going after Obama for it whenever the Republicans are so much worse and everything? That was my bad. Because I was complacent under Obama, and I was clearly wrong for that. And that's part of the reason why I'm so angry now. Part of it is I'm angry at myself for having become as complacent as I did, because of the fact that I knew better. I knew better because I was so radical for so much of my life up until then. And I did end up kind of falling for the message of hope and change, even though he ultimately gave us very little. We became more conservative as a nation under Obama, rather than moving away from the continual trend towards the right, towards conservatism. So anyway, that was a little bit off topic, and again, harm reduction. It's all about trying to move in the right direction. It's all about, none of us are perfect. We don't have to be the perfect activist, but we do need to try to do better, try to do more, and try to push in the right direction. Thanks again. Hope you like and subscribe, and have a great rest of your week.